"Kid, the waiter put something in your drink," said the poor boy to the millionaire with eyes wide with fear. The businessman hesitated, but something in the boy's gaze stopped him from drinking. That simple warning revealed a sabotage plot that had been destroying his reputation from within for months. Without knowing it, he had just found the only ally capable of unmasking the entire conspiracy. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. We'll continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear in your life. Richard Morgan was tired. It wasn't just physical fatigue after hours of meetings, but an exhaustion that had been accumulating for months. Sitting in the most discreet corner of the Bella Vista restaurant, he massaged his temples while waiting for his orange juice to arrive. The place, known for its select clientele and private atmosphere, was his refuge on the most difficult days, and the difficult days seemed endless. Morgan Developments, the company he had inherited from his father and transformed into one of the country's largest real estate enterprises, was suffering constant attacks. First came contracts broken without justification by long-standing partners. Then, surprise inspections that seemed to know exactly where to look for irregularities. Finally, mass resignations of key employees occurring in the same week, paralyzing essential projects. "Your juice, sir." The waiter placed the glass in front of him with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Richard thanked him with a nod, watching distractedly as the man walked away with hurried steps. That's when he felt a light tug on his sleeve. Looking to the side, he saw a boy of approximately 10 years old, disheveled hair and worn clothes. His eyes, however, were alert and intelligent. "Mister, don't drink that." The voice was low, almost a whisper. Richard frowned. "How did you get in here?" "I hide in the kitchen sometimes. They give me food." The boy looked nervously over his shoulder. "But that doesn't matter. I saw that man putting something in your juice when no one was looking." Richard observed the glass in front of him. The orange liquid looked perfectly normal. His first instinct was to dismiss the boy, perhaps even call security. Street children often invented stories to get money or food. "Please believe me." The urgency in the boy's voice made him hesitate. At that moment, he noticed that the waiter was watching them from a distance, his face a mask of poorly disguised nervousness. When their eyes met, the man quickly looked away and disappeared into the kitchen. Richard pushed the glass away. "What's your name?" "Michael." The boy seemed relieved to see that the man believed him. "And how did you know he put something in my drink?" "I see things. People think I'm not paying attention, but I'm always watching." Michael cast another glance at the kitchen entrance. "That man has never been here before, and he was watching you a lot when you arrived." Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. In recent months, he had developed growing paranoia, constantly feeling watched. Now the boy's words seemed to confirm his fears. "I need to leave," Michael said, taking a step back. "If they catch me here." "Wait." Richard discreetly took some bills from his wallet and extended them to the boy. "Thank you for the warning." Michael looked at the money with hesitation, but eventually accepted it. Before he could thank him, the restaurant manager appeared. His face contorted in disapproval at seeing the boy. "Forgive me, Mr. Morgan, I don't know how he got in. I'll call security immediately." Richard raised his hand. "That's not necessary. The boy isn't bothering me." "But, sir," I said, "it's not necessary." His voice acquired the firm tone he used in difficult negotiations. The manager backed away, still casting suspicious glances at Michael. Richard turned his attention back to the boy. "Where do you live, Michael?" The question made the boy stiffen. "Around." "Do you have family?" "Had." That was all he said. Eyes fixed on the floor. Richard knew he should simply thank the boy and go on his way, call the authorities to deal with another abandoned child. It was protocol, the sensible thing. But something in Michael's gaze, the same perceptiveness that had possibly just saved his life, made him make an impulsive decision. "Would you like a temporary job?" Michael raised his eyes, confused. "Job? I need someone observant, someone people don't notice. In exchange, I offer shelter, food, and fair payment." Richard couldn't believe what he was proposing, but the succession of strange events in recent months had left him without conventional options. To do what? Observe. Like you did today. Michael studied Richard's face for a long moment, as if trying to decide if he could trust this stranger in an expensive suit. Finally, he nodded slowly. Let's go then. Richard left enough money to cover the untouched bill and stood up. As they passed the manager, he said firmly, "That new waiter, I want to know where he came from and who recommended him." 2 hours later, Michael was in Richard's penthouse apartment, looking with wide eyes at the luxury surrounding him. After a shower and dressed in new clothes bought in a hurry, the boy looked like another person, still too thin, still with suspicious eyes, but clearly more relaxed. "So, you want me to spy on people?" he asked while attacking a plate of food that Richard had ordered for delivery. "Not exactly spy, just observe." Richard showed photos of some employees on his tablet. "These are the executives who have the most contact with sensitive documents. In my company, in recent months, important information has been leaking to competitors." Michael studied the photos with interest. "And you think one of them is betraying you?" "Maybe. Or maybe they're being manipulated." Richard hesitated. "There's something bigger happening. Today's incident wasn't isolated." "What do you mean?" Richard explained about the growing problems his company had been facing: broken contracts, suspicious inspections, synchronized resignations. As he spoke, he realized how paranoid it all sounded, especially as he was confiding his suspicions to a child he barely knew. "Seems like someone wants to take you down," Michael commented with surprising objectivity. "And it's not just one person, it's too much to be the work of just one." Richard was impressed with the accurate assessment. "Exactly what I think." Michael finished eating and looked seriously at Richard. "Why do you trust me? I could be part of all this." The question caught Richard off guard. For a moment, he considered the absurd possibility that the supposed rescue at the restaurant was elaborated so that he would bring the boy into his home. But he dismissed the idea almost immediately. "Let's say it's instinct." Michael shrugged. "All right, I'll help, but there's one condition." "What?" "I want to study. It's been a long time since I went to school." The request surprised Richard. It wasn't what he expected from a street child. "Consider it done." That night, while Michael slept in the guest room, Richard stayed awake, reviewing the day's events. Part of him questioned his sanity for trusting a street kid to help him unravel a possible conspiracy. Another part, however, felt that he had just found his only true ally. He picked up his cell phone and called Lucy, his personal assistant, the only person in the company he still trusted. "Lucy, I need you to do something discreetly. Investigate the background of that lawyer, Greg Mitchell, who has been very close to the board lately. There's something about him I don't like." "Any specific reason to distrust him?" Richard hesitated. "Let's say I received a tip. And Lucy, don't mention this to anyone, absolutely no one." As he hung up, he looked at the door of the room where Michael was sleeping. The boy who had possibly saved his life today could be the key to saving everything he had built over the years. Or he could just be a distraction while his world collapsed. Either way, Richard knew that from that moment on, nothing would be the same. The following days established an unusual routine between Richard and Michael. In the morning, a private tutor came to the apartment to assess the boy's educational level and begin to recover lost time. In the afternoon, Michael discreetly accompanied Richard to some meetings, always introduced as a nephew of an employee who was getting to know the work environment. It was impressive how the boy became practically invisible when he wanted to. He would sit quietly in a corner, apparently distracted with an educational tablet that Richard had given him, but his eyes registered everything. And more importantly, he caught nuances that escaped Richard. "That woman in the blue blazer, the one who stays near your office," Michael commented after the third day. "She always pretends to be busy when you pass by, but as soon as you enter your office, she takes out her cell phone and sends messages." "Christine," Richard frowned. "She's been my secretary for almost 5 years. And that tall man with glasses, he looks a lot at the papers on your desk when you're not looking." "Edward is my financial director, Michael. He needs to see documents." The boy shrugged. "I'm just saying what I saw." Despite his initial skepticism, Richard began to pay more attention to the details mentioned by Michael. He noticed that indeed Christine sent messages whenever he entered the room, and Edward seemed especially interested in certain documents that shouldn't be within his purview. On a particularly tense afternoon, Richard received a phone call from Lucy. "I discovered some things about Greg Mitchell," she said in a low voice, as if afraid of being heard. "He worked for Vertex City before coming to us." Richard felt his stomach sink. Vertex City was precisely the company that had benefited most from Morgan Development's recent problems, absorbing contracts and clients that were previously his. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely, and more. He left there exactly 8 months ago. Coincidentally, that's when our problems started." Richard hung up the phone thoughtfully. Michael, who was leafing through an advanced math book on the sofa, looked up. "Bad news?" "Maybe," Richard hesitated, still not entirely comfortable discussing such serious matters with a child, but Michael's insight constantly surprised him. "Remember that lawyer I mentioned? We discovered that he worked for our biggest competitor before coming to us." Michael closed the book. "And he started working for you when the problems began?" "Exactly." "Then it's him." The simplicity of the conclusion made Richard smile sadly. "It's not that simple, Michael. We need proof, and even if it is him, I doubt he's acting alone." The boy seemed to consider this for a moment. "I can help get proof." "How?" "Let me stay in the room next to his, that little room with the file cabinet." Richard shook his head. "It's too risky. If he's really involved in something illegal, it could be dangerous for you." "Nobody notices children," insisted Michael, "especially when they pretend to be entertained with games. I can record his conversations." The idea was absurd, but also ingenious. After much insistence from Michael and careful planning, Richard agreed to a limited plan. The boy would stay in the file room with the door ajar only during a specific meeting that Greg would have with external representatives. The day of the meeting arrived, and Richard could barely concentrate on his own work. Michael was positioned in the file room, equipped with a cell phone programmed to record. The plan was for him to pretend to be playing games if anyone entered. The hours dragged on. When he finally saw Michael returning with Lucy, who was helping with the operation, Richard almost jumped out of his chair. "Well?" Michael seemed excited but contained. "We need to listen in a safe place." They went to Richard's apartment. There, they connected the cell phone to a sound system to hear the recording clearly. The quality wasn't perfect, but sufficient to understand the conversation. Greg's voice was unmistakable. "The inspections are scheduled for next week. I have a contact who will ensure that the focus is on the East Zone projects." "An unknown." A voice responded, "And what about the documents we discussed?" "They're being prepared. Soon we'll have enough material for a lawsuit that will completely paralyze Morgan's operation." "Does Morgan still trust you?" Greg's laugh was cold. "Completely. He thinks I'm protecting the company's interests, when in fact I'm documenting every little irregularity to use against him. Remember, Victor wants the company on its knees before making the final offer. No mistakes this time." Victor. The name hit Richard like a punch. Victor Anderson, owner of Vertex City and his longtime rival. Years ago, Richard had reported irregularities in bids that favored Victor's company, resulting in investigations that nearly drove Vertex City to bankruptcy. The recording continued, revealing details about corrupted inspectors, forged documents, and infiltrated employees. It was a complex operation, meticulously planned to destroy Richard's reputation and business before forcing him to sell the company for a fraction of its value. "So that's it," murmured Richard, when the recording ended. "An elaborate revenge." Michael, who had listened to everything in silence, looked worried. "What now?" "Now we have to gather more evidence and confront them legally." Richard began pacing the apartment, his mind working furiously. "This recording is a start, but we need more. Documents, witnesses, anything that proves this conspiracy." "But if we confront them now, they'll know we've discovered them and might accelerate the plan," observed Michael with relentless logic. Richard looked at the boy with new respect. You're right. We need to be cautious. That night, after Michael went to bed, Richard called his oldest friend, Detective Paul Rivers. Without going into many details, he asked for advice on how to proceed in a situation involving possible corporate fraud and corruption. You need concrete evidence, Rich, advised Paul. Recordings are good, but can be contested in court if obtained without authorization. Documents, emails, financial transfers, that's what really matters. The next morning, Richard implemented new security measures on his computer and cell phone, fearing they were being monitored. With Lucy's help, he began cataloging each suspicious incident of the past few months, looking for patterns and connections that could strengthen his case. Michael, meanwhile, continued his discreet observations. During a visit to the office, he noticed something peculiar. That secretary, Christine, she uses 2 cell phones, he commented as they returned home. One stays on her desk, the other she keeps in her purse, and only uses when she thinks no one is looking. Richard considered the information. Christine had access to practically all his documents and schedule. If she was compromised, the potential damage would be enormous. We need to verify this, decided Richard. With the help of the IT department, using the excuse of a security update, Richard gained access to Christine's corporate email records. What he found confirmed his worst suspicions. She was sending copies of confidential documents to an unidentified email address. This is getting bigger than I imagined, confessed Richard to Michael, feeling the weight of betrayal. Why don't you just fire everyone suspicious? Asked the boy with the simplicity of his age. Richard smiled sadly. Because we still don't know who all the involved parties are. And if I start firing people abruptly, I'll alert the others. We need to discover the full extent of this web before acting. The investigation continued for another week. Richard, Michael, and Lucy formed an unlikely trio of detectives, each playing a crucial role. Lucy used her contacts to track information about Vertex City and Victor Anderson. Richard analyzed documents and emails looking for suspicious patterns, and Michael continued to be the eyes and ears in places where adults didn't pay attention. It was Michael who discovered the next important piece of the puzzle. During an afternoon at the office, while pretending to be absorbed in his educational tablet, he observed a whispered conversation between Edward, the financial director, and a man he had never seen before. They were talking about transfers and something called Operation Phoenix, Michael reported afterwards, and the man said that everything is ready for the final phase. Richard felt a chill. Operation Phoenix. The same name had appeared in an encrypted email that Lucy found while investigating Greg. We need to find out what this final phase is, said Richard, a new sense of urgency in his voice. I can follow Edward, suggested Michael, his eyes shining with the excitement of the hunt. No way, Richard responded firmly. What we're doing is dangerous enough. I won't put you at even greater risk. What Richard didn't know was that his time was running out quickly. The final phase was closer than he imagined and was about to involve the person who, surprisingly, had become his greatest ally, little Michael. That night, while Richard worked in his home office, Michael appeared at the door with a serious expression. Someone's watching us, he said calmly. Their black car stopped across the street 2 hours ago. There are 2 men inside. Richard went to the window and peeked discreetly. The car was exactly where Michael had said, with 2 men apparently waiting. How did you notice that? Michael shrugged. I always notice these things. On the street, you learn to tell when you're being watched. Richard felt a knot in his stomach. The situation was escalating faster than he had anticipated. They needed to act immediately. Michael, I think it's time to accelerate our plan. Tomorrow, we'll make a surprise visit to Greg's office. The E. Next morning began with an unexpected call. Richard answered the phone, still drowsy, surprised to hear the voice of a social worker. Mr. Morgan? I'm Deborah Adams from Child Protective Services. We received an anonymous report about a child possibly in an irregular situation at your residence. Richard felt his blood freeze. What exactly are you talking about? We need to verify the welfare of a minor who would be under your care without legal documentation. We're on our way to your apartment for a routine visit." Before he could respond, the woman hung up. Richard ran to Michael's room, finding him already awake and arranging his schoolbooks. "Michael, we need to talk." Richard quickly explained the situation. "I think this is part of their plan. Somehow they found out about you." The boy nodded, surprisingly calm. "What do we do?" "We can't just run away. That would look like an admission of guilt." Richard thought quickly. "I'll call my detective friend. Meanwhile, act normally." Paul answered on the second ring. After hearing Richard's hurried explanation, he promised to verify the legitimacy of the visit and arrive as soon as possible. 20 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Richard opened the door to find a woman in a suit with a serious expression, accompanied by two men who introduced themselves as support officers. "Mr. Morgan, I'm Deborah Adams." She showed an identification that looked official. "May we come in?" Richard reluctantly gave way. Michael was sitting in the living room, pretending to concentrate on a science book. "Is this the minor in question?" asked Deborah, approaching Michael. "Yes, this is Michael. I'm helping him temporarily while we regularize his situation." Richard tried to keep his voice steady. The woman knelt in front of the boy. "Hello, Michael, can you come with me for a moment? We need to talk in private." Michael cast a glance at Richard, who nodded slightly, trying to convey confidence. While the two moved away to the bedroom, Richard noticed that one of the men was discreetly photographing the apartment. "May I ask the purpose of these photos?" he questioned. "Standard procedure," the man responded dryly. "Documentation of the environment." Something wasn't right. The way they moved, the lack of clear identifications beyond what was initially shown, everything seemed too calculated. Richard sent an urgent message to Paul. "They're already here. Something's wrong." When Deborah returned with Michael, the boy looked tense, his eyes conveying a silent message to Richard. "Mr. Morgan, we need to take Michael for a more complete assessment," announced the woman. "It's standard procedure in cases like this." "Not without a court order," Richard countered, "or without the presence of my lawyer." Deborah smiled coldly. "I'm afraid the law authorizes me to remove a child from a potentially irregular environment. Your resistance only complicates the situation." One of the men took a step forward, his posture subtly threatening. Richard was about to argue when the doorbell rang again. Paul Rivers entered, his badge clearly visible. "I'm Detective Rivers. I'd like to see your credentials, ma'am." Deborah's face lost some of its confidence. She showed her identification again, which Paul examined carefully. "Interesting," he commented. "I personally called Child Protective Services before coming. There is no Deborah Adams registered, nor any visits scheduled for this address." The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The two men exchanged quick glances, clearly considering their options. "There must be some mistake," said Deborah, her voice now less certain. "I received direct instructions to—" "I'm going to need all three of you to accompany me to the police station for clarification," interrupted Paul, his hand discreetly moving closer to his weapon. What happened next was too fast for Richard to fully process. One of the men pushed Paul while the other grabbed Michael. Deborah pulled a small object from her purse, a taser, Richard realized belatedly, and advanced in his direction. Paul reacted quickly, drawing his gun and shouting orders. Richard threw himself to the side, barely avoiding the electrical discharge. In the midst of the confusion, he saw Michael being dragged out of the apartment. "Michael!" he shouted, trying to reach him, but the man who was holding Paul blocked his path. The fight that followed was brief and violent. Paul managed to subdue his opponent, but when they finally reached the hallway, the other three, including Michael, had already disappeared. "They were prepared," said Paul, breathless, as he called for reinforcements on the radio. This wasn't improvised. Richard felt a wave of despair. In just a few minutes, Michael had been torn from his protection, and he knew exactly why. "It's a trap," he murmured. "They took him to force me to do something." As if confirming his theory, his cell phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. "Morgan Development's conference room, 1 hour. Come alone or the boy suffers the consequences. Richard showed the message to Paul. I can't risk his life. That's exactly what they want, argued Paul. You going alone into an ambush. I have no choice. Richard's determination was absolute. But I need you to do something for me. While Richard drove to his company, his mind worked furiously. Michael's kidnapping meant that his enemies were desperate or too confident. Either way, he needed to be smarter. Upon arriving at the Morgan Developments building, he found it strangely empty for a Friday morning. The receptionist greeted him nervously, avoiding his gaze. In the elevator, he took a deep breath, mentally, preparing for what would come next. The conference room was occupied by 3 people: Greg Mitchell, Edward, his financial director, and Victor Anderson, the man who had sworn to destroy him. Richard, punctual as always. Victor smiled, indicating a chair. Please sit down. Richard remained standing. Where is Michael? The boy is safe, responded Victor casually. For now. His well-being depends entirely on your cooperation. Greg pushed a folder across the table. Simple documents, a confession of tax fraud, bid manipulation, and bribery of inspectors. Sign it, and also the transfer of control of the company to the group managed by Mr. Anderson. Richard looked at the papers, incredulous. You really think I'm going to sign a false confession? False? Victor laughed. Greg, show him. The lawyer opened a laptop, displaying photos that seemed to show Richard delivering envelopes to public officials, emails apparently sent by him discussing bribes, and even bank records showing suspicious transfers. All perfectly fabricated, commented Victor, but indistinguishable from the real thing to any expert. In a few hours, this will be in the hands of the police and the press, unless, of course, you cooperate. Richard felt the weight of the meticulously prepared trap. They had thought of everything. Even if he could eventually prove his innocence, the damage to his reputation and the company would be irreparable. And if I sign, what happens to Michael? The boy will be released unharmed, promised Victor. He is irrelevant to us, just a means to an end. Richard stared at each of the 3 men, evaluating his options. Finally, he picked up the pen. I'll sign, but with one condition. I want to talk to Michael first, confirm that he's okay. Victor considered the request for a moment, then nodded to Edward, who made a quick call. Soon, Michael's frightened voice sounded over the speakerphone. Richard, they've locked me up somewhere, I'm fine, but... The call was abruptly ended. Satisfied? Asked Victor. Richard recognized Michael's voice, but also noticed something. In the way the boy had spoken, a code they had established for emergencies. I'm fine meant the opposite. I need a moment to read the documents, said Richard, buying time. There's no need, cut in Greg. It's sign or face the consequences. Richard feigned resignation and began signing the documents slowly, one by one. As he did so, he discreetly checked his watch. If Paul had followed his plan any moment, as if answering his thoughts, his cell phone vibrated with a message. He checked it quickly, ignoring the suspicious looks from the others. It seems you're not the only ones with a plan B, commented Richard, suddenly confident. Victor frowned. What does that mean? It means that at this exact moment police officers are recovering Michael. And more importantly, Lucy just sent all the evidence we collected about your conspiracy to the federal police and to several journalists. Victor's expression oscillated between disbelief and fury. You're bluffing. Am I? Richard showed Lucy's message. Package delivered. M safe. Impossible, murmured Greg, his face pale. How could you know where the boy was? Richard smiled. Michael is smarter than you imagine. He managed to activate the location on the cell phone I gave him. And as for the evidence against you, let's say we've been recording every suspicious move for weeks. The conference room door opened abruptly. Paul entered, accompanied by 2 police officers. Victor Anderson, Greg Mitchell, and Edward Foster, you are being detained for questioning about kidnapping, extortion, and conspiracy. While the police proceeded with the arrests, Richard felt a wave of relief, but his main concern continued to be Michael. Paul, the boy. He's on his way. My men found him in a warehouse near the port. He's scared, but physically unharmed. Richard felt his knees weaken with relief. The trap that his enemies had so carefully prepared had ended up turning against themselves. As Victor was being led away, he cast a venomous look at Richard. "This isn't over, Morgan. I have enough influence to get out in a few hours, and when I do—" "Save your threats for the judge," interrupted Paul, pushing him out. Richard was left alone in the conference room, exhausted but victorious. The battle had been won, but he knew the war was just beginning. Victor was right on one point. A man with his resources and connections wouldn't stay detained for long. His cell phone rang. It was Lucy. "Boss, I'm with Michael. We're coming." "To you." "You two are amazing," responded Richard, his voice choked with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." "Thank the kid. It was his idea to hide a second cell phone in his sock in case something happened. He's a genius." Richard smiled, imagining the boy's cleverness. In just a few days, Michael had become not only a valuable ally, but someone Richard was willing to risk everything to protect. When he finally saw Michael entering the room, he couldn't contain the impulse to hug him tightly. The boy, initially tense with the physical contact, soon relaxed in Richard's arms. "You did it," murmured Michael. "You caught them." "We did it," corrected Richard. "And this is just the beginning." Richard's prediction was confirmed. Less than 24 hours later, Victor Anderson was released on bail. Greg and Edward remained detained, but the real mastermind behind the conspiracy was free and furious. The response wasn't long in coming. The next morning, all the major news portals displayed sensationalist headlines about alleged fraud at Morgan Developments. The carefully fabricated false evidence had been leaked to the press. "They fulfilled their threat," commented Lucy, showing the news on her tablet as she met with Richard in his apartment. As a precaution, they had decided not to return to the office yet. Richard observed Michael, who was sitting near the window with headphones on, apparently absorbed in an educational app. After the trauma of the kidnapping, the boy seemed quieter but surprisingly resilient. "How are we doing with our counterattack?" asked Richard, turning his attention to Lucy. "The recordings Michael got are good, but not enough to dismantle the entire narrative they've created. We need something more substantial." Richard ran his hand through his hair, frustrated. Victor had months to fabricate this evidence. We had days to gather ours. At that moment, Michael removed his headphones and approached. "Can I help?" Lucy and Richard exchanged hesitant glances. After the kidnapping, both had agreed to keep the boy away from any dangerous aspect of the situation. "It's not necessary, Michael," responded Richard gently. "You've already done more than enough." "But I have an idea," insisted the boy. "When they took me, one of the men was talking on the phone. He mentioned something about all the recordings being kept safe in the usual place." Richard frowned. "What place would that be?" "I don't know, but he said it was in the doctor's office." Lucy straightened in her chair. "Greg, he must have kept copies of everything in his office. We know he's too meticulous to rely only on digital files." "Even if that's true, we can't just break into his office," argued Richard. "We don't need to break in," said Lucy with a growing smile. "As your corporate lawyer, all documents in his office at the company technically belong to Morgan Developments. We can do a completely legal, routine audit." The plan was put into action immediately. While Lucy coordinated the corporate security team to inventory Greg's office, Richard faced another battle: public opinion. With the help of his legal department, he issued an official statement denying all accusations and promising full transparency in the investigations. Michael, despite Richard's initial protests, insisted on accompanying Lucy. "I know exactly what to look for," he argued. "I've been observing Greg for days. I know his habits." Reluctantly, Richard agreed, on the condition that the boy remain with security at all times. The audit in Greg's office initially revealed nothing beyond the expected. Cabinets were opened, drawers inspected, paintings removed from walls in search of hidden safes. Nothing. It was Michael who noticed the crucial detail. The rug, he pointed out, observing a small irregularity in the floor under the elegant Persian rug. It's misaligned as if it were moved frequently. Upon removing the rug, they discovered a small compartment built into the floor. Inside, a metal box containing external hard drives and carefully organized documents. "Bingo," murmured Lucy, photographing everything before removing the items. The content was exactly what they needed. Original emails that had been altered to create the false evidence against Richard, records of payments from Vertex City to employees infiltrated at Morgan Developments, and most impressively, recordings of meetings between Victor, Greg, and other conspirators openly discussing their sabotage plan. "Greg was paranoid enough to keep records of everything," commented Lucy as they examined the material in a secure location, "probably as insurance against Victor himself. This is more than enough to dismantle the accusations against me and turn the tables," said Richard, feeling for the first time in months that the tide was turning in his favor. The counterattack was carefully orchestrated. First, the material was delivered simultaneously to the authorities and to selected journalists known for their integrity. Then, Richard gave an exclusive interview, presenting part of the evidence and explaining the systematic campaign against his company. The reaction was immediate. The same publications that had emblazoned accusations against Richard now highlighted the conspiracy of which he had been a victim. Victor Anderson quickly found himself cornered, with arrest warrants being issued against him and several of his associates. Amid this reversal, Richard didn't forget the person who had made it all possible. Michael observed the news with fascination, clearly proud of his role but also visibly concerned. "What happens to me now?" he asked one night as they dined in the apartment. The question caught Richard off guard. With the adrenaline of the fight against Victor, he hadn't really considered the boy's future. "Well, legally, I need to notify the authorities about your situation," he responded honestly. "They'll look for your family or determine a temporary home." Michael's face instantly closed. "So, I'll go back to the streets?" "Not necessarily," said Richard carefully. "There are good institutions, foster families. No place where I can really belong," completed Michael, his voice small but resigned. Richard felt something tighten in his chest. In just a few weeks, this extraordinary boy had become a fundamental part of his life. The idea of seeing him disappear into the system was unbearable. What if? Richard hesitated, surprised by the thought that had just emerged. "What if you stayed with me? Legally, I mean." Michael raised his eyes, confused. "What do you mean?" "Adoption," explained Richard, the idea crystallizing as he spoke. "It would be a long process with a lot of bureaucracy, but I could try to be your legal guardian if you want, of course." Michael's eyes widened, a mixture of hope and distrust. "Why? Why would you do that?" "Because you saved not only my life but everything I built," responded Richard with sincerity. "But more than that, because I've never met anyone with your intelligence, courage, and integrity. It would be an honor to be able to give you a home." For a moment, Michael seemed speechless, visibly struggling against emotions that perhaps he had never allowed himself to feel. Finally, he nodded, a small smile beginning to form. "I would like that," he said simply. In the following months, while Morgan Developments recovered from the attack and Victor Anderson faced a growing number of accusations, Richard initiated the complex adoption process. As expected, he encountered resistance in the system. A single businessman with no parenting experience was not considered the ideal candidate to adopt a child. Michael, however, didn't make things easier by categorically refusing to consider any other option. "I want to stay with Richard," he firmly declared in each interview with social workers. The process dragged on for almost a year, with psychological evaluations, home visits, and endless court hearings. During this time, Michael remained with Richard under a temporary guardianship arrangement obtained thanks to Paul's influence and the excellent legal team hired for the case. The boy flourished under Richard's care. Enrolled in one of the best schools in the city, he quickly overcame his educational delay and began to excel academically. His capacity for observation and logical analysis impressed teachers and classmates. In parallel, Morgan Developments underwent a transformation. With the conspiracy exposed and those responsible facing justice, Richard took the opportunity to reorganize the company with new values. Transparency, ethics, and social responsibility became non-negotiable pillars. "The crisis showed us our vulnerabilities," he explained in a meeting with the newly formed board, "but it also gave us the opportunity to rebuild something better." Not everyone welcomed the changes. A group of traditional shareholders expressed concern about the company's new direction, especially when Richard announced the creation of a department dedicated to social housing projects. "We're losing focus on profits," argued one of the oldest shareholders during a tense meeting. "And frankly, your obsession with adopting that street kid is affecting your professional judgment." The comment caused an uncomfortable silence in the room. Richard stood up slowly, his gaze cold. "That street kid, as you called him, saved this company when many of you were ready to abandon ship. And as for profits, our new social projects have attracted 3 major international investors interested in sustainable business. So unless you have something constructive to add, I suggest you reconsider your position." The internal conflict in the company continued, but Richard remained firm. Each quarter, the positive results strengthened his position. Morgan Developments not only recovered from the crisis, but emerged stronger and with a renewed reputation in the market. Finally, after 14 months of legal battle, the day of the final adoption hearing arrived. Richard and Michael entered the court together, both wearing matching suits, the boy's idea that Richard found too adorable to refuse. The judge, a middle-aged woman with perceptive eyes, reviewed the extensive process before addressing Michael directly. "Young man, do you fully understand what is happening here today?" Michael nodded with the seriousness that characterized him. "Yes, ma'am. Richard wants to legally become my father, and I want him to be my father." "And are you aware that there are other options? Families with experience in raising children, with more traditional structures?" "With all due respect, Your Honor," responded Michael with eloquence surprising for his 11 years, "I already had a traditional family that abandoned me. Richard chose me when no one else would. He risked everything to protect me when he could simply have handed me over to the authorities. I can't imagine a better father." The judge smiled slightly, clearly impressed. After some additional questions and final considerations, she brought down the gavel. "Having reviewed all the reports and witnessed the evident connection between you, I consider that the adoption serves the child's best interest. Petition approved." Richard felt tears in his eyes as he hugged Michael, now officially his son. The boy, usually restrained in his displays of affection, returned the hug with equal intensity. As they left the court, they were greeted by Lucy, Paul, and a small group of close friends who had supported the journey. Flowers, hugs, and congratulations surrounded father and son as they headed to the car. "And now?" asked Michael when they were finally alone, on the way to the restaurant where they would celebrate with friends. Richard smiled, feeling a peace he hadn't experienced in years. "Now we build our future together, one day at a time." Michael nodded, satisfied with the answer. After a moment of comfortable silence, he added, "There's something I wanted to tell you." "What?" "Remember that waiter? The one who put something in your juice the day we met?" Richard frowned, surprised by the mention of that first day that seemed to have happened in another life. "I remember." "Why?" "I saw him last week, working at a diner near the school. He recognized me and almost ran away, but I followed him." Michael hesitated. "He told me he was hired by Victor's lawyer to poison you. It wasn't meant to kill you, just to make you sick enough to miss an important meeting." Richard shook his head, impressed. "And why is he telling you this now?" "Because he regrets it. He said he only accepted the job because his daughter was sick and needed expensive treatment. He was desperate." Michael looked at Richard with intensity. "He apologized and said he wants to tell everything to the police." Richard reflected on that information for a moment. This could help strengthen the case against Victor even more. "Yes, but..." Michael hesitated. "I was thinking, he really seemed sorry. What if instead of simply sending him to jail, we gave him a second chance, like you did with me?" Richard looked at his son with a mixture of surprise and pride. Michael's compassion, even after everything he had experienced on the streets, was extraordinary. "You know what? Let's talk to him. Maybe we can find a solution that serves justice without destroying another family." Michael smiled, satisfied. As the car advanced through the city streets, Richard reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them here. What had begun as a simple warning from a street boy had transformed into a new life for both of them. The conspiracy that had nearly destroyed him ended up giving him the most precious gift he could ever imagine: a son. 5 years passed since the official adoption. Michael, now 16, had transformed into a brilliant, determined teenager, surprisingly mature for his age. His analytical capacity, which had so impressed Richard in the early days, now manifested in extraordinary academic achievements and a deep understanding of the family business. Morgan Developments, in turn, had become a model of ethical corporate governance. The social housing department, initially viewed with skepticism by many executives, had proven to be not only socially relevant, but also economically viable, attracting international investors interested in sustainable projects. On that sunny Thursday morning, Richard proudly watched as Michael presented his high school final project, a digital audit system that identified suspicious patterns in corporate financial transactions. The algorithm analyzes statistical deviations in real time, Michael explained confidently to the audience of teachers, classmates, and invited executives. Small irregularities that would go unnoticed in isolation are grouped and correlated, revealing possible fraud before it becomes systematic. The project had been directly inspired by the experience with Victor Anderson's conspiracy. Michael had transformed the trauma into something constructive, a constant in his personality that never ceased to impress Richard. After the presentation, which received top marks and offers from 2 prestigious university programs, father and son celebrated at their favorite restaurant. "Harvard or MIT?" asked Richard as they toasted with orange juice, a tradition between them since their fateful first meeting. "I haven't decided yet," responded Michael. "Both have excellent computer science programs with an emphasis on business ethics." Richard smiled. Who would have thought that that suspicious street kid would become an academic prodigy courted by the best universities in the world? Who would have thought that that stern businessman would become the most doting father in the universe? Retorted Michael with a mischievous smile. They laughed, sharing that complicity that had strengthened over the years. Michael's laugh, once so rare, was now a frequent sound that illuminated Richard's life. "I have news," said Richard after a moment. "We finally managed to approve the creation of the Morgan Institute." Michael's eyes shone. The Institute was a project they had been developing for years, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping companies in difficulty to restructure ethically, avoiding bankruptcies and protecting jobs. Seriously? The board approved the budget? Richard nodded. Unanimously, even the most conservative shareholders were convinced by the preliminary results of the pilot project. We already have 3 companies enrolled for the mentoring program. And what about the professional reintegration project? Also approved. Carl will be our first participant. Carl was the waiter who had put the substance in Richard's juice years ago. As Michael had suggested, they had offered the man a second chance. Instead of pressing for criminal charges, Richard had helped him testify against the true culprits in exchange for immunity. Since then, Carl had worked in various temporary jobs, always struggling against the stigma of his past. "Will he be in the security department?" asked Michael. "Actually, I thought of something different. He has experience in restaurants and has always dreamed of having his own business. We're going to finance a management course and then help him open a small cafe on the ground floor of our new development in the South Zone." Michael smiled, approving the idea. "Transforming adversaries into allies, your specialty." "Our specialty," corrected Richard. The moment was interrupted by Richard's cell phone. It was Lucy, now CEO of Morgan Developments, while Richard dedicated himself primarily to the Institute. "Richard, we have a problem," she said without preamble. "Victor Anderson was released today." Richard felt a tightness in his chest. After years of legal battles, Victor had been convicted of various charges, of fraud, corruption, and for Michael's kidnapping. The original sentence had predicted at least 8 years of imprisonment. How is that possible? He served less than half the sentence. Good behavior and a team of very expensive lawyers, responded Lucy bitterly. The news hasn't leaked to the press yet, but I thought you should know immediately. Thanks, Lucy. I'll take the necessary precautions. As he hung up, Richard met Michael's attentive gaze. Even without hearing the other side of the conversation, the young man had understood the gravity of the situation. Victor is free, he stated, not as a question. Richard nodded. Don't worry, he won't get near us. I'm not worried about myself, responded Michael seriously. I'm worried about you. Victor lost everything because of you. People like him don't just move on. Michael's words echoed Richard's own fears. During the years of imprisonment, Victor had lost not only his freedom, but also his company. Vertex City had gone bankrupt after the revelations about its fraudulent practices, and his assets had been frozen to pay indemnities. We'll increase security, decided Richard. And maybe we should postpone the trip to Boston next week. Michael shook his head. No, we're not going to let him control our lives. The university visits are important for my decision. Richard admired his son's determination, but the concern persisted. At least let's take Paul with us. He's on vacation and had already offered to accompany us. That seems reasonable, agreed Michael. In the following days, the news of Victor's release became public, generating a wave of reports recalling the corporate scandal and the extraordinary story of how a street boy had dismantled an elaborate conspiracy. Richard received various contacts from journalists seeking statements, but preferred silence. Michael, on the other hand, surprised him by agreeing to participate in an interview for a documentary about business ethics. Are you sure you want to expose our story that way? Asked Richard, concerned. It's important to show that companies can be ethical and still successful, responded Michael with conviction. And I also want to inspire other children in difficult situations, show that there's always hope. Michael's maturity sometimes left Richard speechless. At 16, he demonstrated a wisdom that many adults would never achieve. The interview was conducted at the Morgan Development's headquarters with reinforced security measures. Michael spoke eloquently about his journey from the streets to adoption and about how the experience had shaped his vision of justice and social responsibility. I grew up observing people invisible to society's eyes, he explained to the cameras. I learned that often the real problems and the real solutions are in the details that most ignore. The repercussion was immediate and positive. In a few hours, the excerpt of the interview released on social networks went viral, transforming Michael into a symbol of overcoming and integrity. You're a celebrity now, joked Richard, as they watched the news together that night. 15 minutes of fame, responded Michael, uncomfortable with the attention. I hope the focus returns to the Institute's work soon. Richard's phone rang. It was an unknown number. Hesitantly, he answered. Richard Morgan. The voice on the other end made his blood freeze. Even after all these years, it was unmistakable. Impressive. What you did with the street kid, said Victor Anderson, his tone falsely cordial. He expresses himself much better than many executives I've known. What do you want, Victor? Richard signaled to Michael, who immediately understood and began tracking the call on his laptop. Just to congratulate you on your son's interview. Very touching, especially the part about second chances and redemption. Victor paused. I wonder if you really believe that, or if it's just rhetoric for the cameras. If you're looking for a second chance, Victor, start by confessing all your crimes and returning the money you diverted. Victor's laugh sounded bitter. Always so virtuous, Morgan. But tell me, do you really think you can protect the boy? Forever? Small world? Ours? You never know when our paths might cross again. Richard felt anger growing, but kept his voice controlled. Is that a threat, Victor? An observation. Just that. After all, we are two civilized businessmen. The falsely cordial tone didn't mask the underlying hostility. "Enjoy the trip to Boston. I heard it's beautiful this time of year." The call ended before Richard could respond. He looked at Michael, who nodded silently. He had managed to track the call. "Disposable phone," informed the young man. "But it was used in a cafe about 5 blocks from here." Richard immediately called Paul, reporting the disturbing call. In less than an hour, the detective appeared at the apartment with 2 officers. "This clearly violates the conditions of his parole," explained Paul. "I've contacted the judge responsible for the case. Victor will be summoned to provide clarification, but we can't arrest him just for a phone call without explicit threats." "He mentioned our trip to Boston," said Richard, the concern evident in his voice. "How could he know about that?" "It could have been an educated guess based on Michael's age and the period of university visits," suggested Paul, "or he might have someone monitoring us." The idea of being under surveillance again was disturbing. Richard looked at Michael, expecting to see him frightened, but the young man seemed thoughtful, almost analytical. "We need to go to Boston," affirmed Michael with determination. "If we cancel, he'll know he shook us. Besides," he hesitated, "I think we can use this to our advantage." "What do you mean?" asked Richard, surprised. "If Victor is really planning something, he expects us to panic or try to hide. What if instead we set a trap?" Paul looked at Michael with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Are you suggesting we use you as bait?" "Absolutely not." "Not exactly as bait," corrected Michael, "but we can make our trip seem like a perfect opportunity for him, while in fact we'll be completely prepared. If he tries something, we'll have everything documented." Richard observed his son with conflicting feelings. On one hand, the paternal instinct screamed to protect him from any danger. On the other, he recognized that Michael was no longer that vulnerable child from the streets. He was a brilliant young strategist who perhaps understood the adversary better than anyone. After hours of discussion and planning, they reached a compromise. The trip to Boston would happen, but with extraordinary security measures. Paul and 2 trusted agents would discreetly accompany them. All details of the itinerary would be kept in absolute secrecy, with false information being strategically leaked to confuse possible observers. On the eve of departure, while finalizing preparations, Richard found Michael sitting on the apartment balcony, contemplating the city lights. "Nervous?" he asked, joining his son. "Not about Victor," responded Michael. "He's predictable in his obsession. I'm thinking about college, actually, about how everything changed so quickly." Richard smiled, remembering the suspicious boy he had met 6 years ago. "You always knew you were capable of great things. You just needed an opportunity." "It wasn't just the opportunity," said Michael, looking directly at his father. "It was you believing in me when no one else did. That made all the difference." Richard's heart filled with emotion. "You know I'm the one who should thank you. Right? You literally saved my life." "And you saved mine," responded Michael simply. "We're even." They laughed together, a moment of lightness before the tension they knew awaited them. The next morning, they embarked for Boston as planned. The trip proceeded without incidents, and the university visits were productive. Michael impressed the program coordinators with his digital audit project and his inspiring story. It was on the 3rd day, during a lecture at the MIT campus, that Michael noticed something strange. "That man," he whispered to Richard, discreetly indicating a middle-aged individual near the auditorium door. "He was at the Harvard campus yesterday and at the restaurant the day before." Richard observed the man without being obvious. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely. Same scar on the neck, same watch too expensive for a common professor." Immediately, Richard sent a message to Paul, who was positioned outside. The detective confirmed that he would put the man under surveillance. Michael's suspicion proved correct. The man was a former Vertex City security guard, now working as a private investigator. Paul managed to intercept him discreetly, and after firm questioning, discovered that he had been hired to monitor Richard and Michael's movements and report directly to Victor. "He didn't mention any specific plan," reported Paul when they met at the hotel that night. "Apparently his function was just observation. But we found something interesting on his phone. Reservations for Victor's flight to Boston arriving tomorrow. Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. So he's coming personally. And we'll be ready, affirmed Michael. The plan continues. As agreed, Paul nodded. With one difference, now we know exactly when and where to look. My men will be positioned at the airport to monitor Victor as soon as he disembarks. The night was restless for Richard. Despite all precautions, the idea of Victor being in the same city as his son filled him with apprehension. He got up several times to check if Michael was sleeping safely in the adjacent room of the hotel suite. The next morning, they received confirmation. Victor had landed in Boston and headed directly to a hotel near the MIT campus, where Michael had scheduled his last interview with the computer science department. He's following our fake itinerary, observed Paul with satisfaction. The team had deliberately leaked information about an important interview at MIT, when in fact Michael had already completed the entire process and was scheduled to visit an old friend of Richard's in another part of the city. So he's going to be waiting for nothing, concluded Richard, feeling more relieved. Not exactly, corrected Michael. I still want to meet him. What? Richard looked at his son as if he had lost his mind. No way. In a public place with all the security around, explained Michael calmly. Think about it. He's expecting to find us unprepared, but we'll be the ones surprising him. It's our chance to show that we're not afraid of him. It's too risky, argued Richard. On the contrary, intervened Paul thoughtfully. It might be our best opportunity, a controlled confrontation, on our terms. Michael would be completely protected, and we could document any attempt by Victor to make threats or improper contact. After much deliberation, they reached a compromise. Michael would briefly appear at the campus cafeteria where, according to the false information, he would have the interview. He would be surrounded by disguised agents and would wear a recording device. Richard would remain at a safe distance, but visible enough to be noticed. When the moment came, Michael entered the cafeteria with the confidence of someone who had nothing to fear. He chose a central table and ordered a coffee while pretending to review some notes. Richard observed from a bench outside through the glass windows, with Paul discreetly positioned a few meters away. It wasn't long before Victor appeared. Even after years in prison, he maintained the impeccable appearance he had always cultivated. Tailored suit, perfectly arranged grey hair, the posture of someone who still commanded the world around him. The only difference was a new hardness, in his eyes a resentment he couldn't completely disguise. He walked directly to Michael's table and sat down without being invited. "Michael Morgan," he said with a cold smile, "the prodigy who came from nowhere." Michael calmly raised his eyes. "Mr. Anderson, I must say I didn't expect to see you here." "Of course you expected," retorted Victor. "Your father and you are too intelligent not to notice you were being followed. In fact, I suspect this whole situation was orchestrated." Michael shrugged. "Think what you want. What do you want from me?" Victor looked at the window, making eye contact with Richard for a brief moment before returning his attention to Michael. "Curiosity, mainly. I wanted to see up close the boy who dismantled everything I built." There was no admiration in his voice, just a cold analysis. "You have potential, you know, more than Richard ever had. He was always driven by foolish ideals about ethics and social responsibility. You, on the other hand, you understand how the world really works." "And how does the world work, according to you?" asked Michael, genuinely interested in the psychology of the man in front of him. "Power, just that. Those who have power dictate the rules. Those who don't either follow or suffer the consequences." Victor leaned forward. "Richard is molding you in his image, but it doesn't have to be that way. You have a natural gift for identifying weaknesses and exploiting them. Imagine what you could accomplish if you weren't bound by antiquated notions of right and wrong." Michael studied the man for a moment, then smiled, a smile that very much resembled Richard's when he perceived a particularly transparent business move. "Fascinating. You really think you can recruit me, after everything you did?" Victor didn't seem disconcerted. Business is business, nothing personal. and people like us can always find common ground when there are mutual interests. People like us, repeated Michael slowly. That's where your mistake is, Mr. Anderson. We're not alike. I grew up on the streets, yes, but I learned that there are two types of survivors, those who step on others to rise, and those who extend a hand to elevate others along with them. Victor's smile diminished slightly. Richard showed me that ethics isn't a limitation, it's a sustainable competitive advantage, continued Michael. Our company not only survived your attack, but flourished. You know why? Because we built trust, and in today's world, trust is the most valuable asset that exists. Victor leaned back, his face now a cold mask. Nice speech. Your father taught you well. But let me tell you something. This story of ethics and social responsibility lasts exactly until the moment you face a real crisis. When that happens, and it will happen, we'll see what kind of man you really are. That's the difference between us, responded Michael serenely. I've already faced my crises. I faced hunger, abandonment, violence on the streets, and I chose not to become like you. Victor stood up, adjusting his jacket. Interesting conversation. Tell your father I hold no grudges. Business is like that. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. We'll see each other again, I'm sure. I'd prefer not, responded Michael honestly. As Victor walked away, Richard quickly entered the cafeteria and joined his son. Are you okay? What did he say? Michael reported the conversation, showing the recording on his cell phone. Paul, who had approached, listened attentively. There were no explicit threats, commented the detective. He was careful, but the simple fact that he sought you out already violates his parole. I'll report this immediately. As they watched Victor leaving the cafeteria, Richard put his arm around his son's shoulders. I'm proud of you. Many adults would have been intimidated. Michael smiled. I learned from the best not to back down to bullies. On the flight back home, Richard couldn't stop thinking about the confrontation. Victor had retreated too easily. Knowing him, this could mean that he had really decided to move on, or that he was planning something more elaborate. Still worried? Asked Michael, noticing his father's thoughtful expression. Just reflecting, responded Richard. Victor was always a strategist. I wonder if this meeting was really the end of the story. Probably not, admitted Michael with surprising frankness. But whatever his next move is, we'll be ready. Richard nodded, recognizing the truth in his son's words. They had faced the worst together and survived. Any future challenge would just be another chapter in their shared journey. 10 years passed since the confrontation in Boston. Life had followed its course, with victories, challenges, and inevitable transformations. Michael, now 26, had graduated with honors from MIT and completed a master's in ethical corporate governance. His thesis on fraud prevention systems had become a reference in the business and academic world. Richard, at 55, dedicated himself almost exclusively to the Morgan Institute, which had grown exponentially, offering consulting for companies in crisis throughout the country. His hair now showed gray strands at the temples, marks of an intense life, but his eyes maintained the same determined sparkle as always. On that sunny morning, father and son walked through the elegant Bella Vista restaurant, now completely renovated but preserving its exclusive atmosphere. It was a special day, exactly 16 years since the first encounter that had changed their lives forever. It still seems surreal to me, commented Richard, observing the place where it all began. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't entered here that day. You probably would have drunk that juice and been sick for a few days, responded Michael pragmatically, provoking a laugh from Richard. And you would have continued. On the streets, wasting that brilliant brain, retorted Richard. They sat at the same table as years ago. The annual tradition had begun 5 years earlier, when Michael had suggested revisiting the place where their lives had crossed. Since then, they made a point of repeating the ritual as a way to honor the journey traveled. Mr. Morgan, your orange juice. The waiter placed the drinks on the table with a warm smile. It was no longer the same establishment as before. Now the Bella Vista belonged to Carl, the ex-waiter who had almost poisoned Richard. The irony didn't escape either of them. Carl approached personally as he did every year. "It's an honor to receive you again," he said sincerely. His life had changed drastically since he had received a second chance. The small cafe on the ground floor of the Morgan development had prospered, allowing him to eventually acquire this historic restaurant. "The pleasure is ours, Carl," responded Richard. "The place looks even more beautiful this year." After the owner's departure, Michael checked his watch. She should arrive any moment. As if summoned by his words, a young woman of approximately 25 entered the restaurant. Anna Rivers, daughter of Detective Paul, was a newly appointed prosecutor and had been dating Michael for just over a year. "Sorry I'm late," she said, joining them. "The traffic was impossible." Richard observed with affection the interaction between the young people. The romance had begun unexpectedly during a charity event at the Institute, and since then had flourished with the same intensity and complicity that characterized everything Michael did in life. "Any news about the Henderson case?" asked Michael after Anna settled in. Anna sighed. "The investigation is advancing, but slowly. Pharmaceutical companies have very good lawyers." Anna was working on a complex case involving overpriced medications in public hospitals. The scheme, discovered thanks to the audit system developed by Michael, had political ramifications that made the investigation particularly delicate. "Do you need more data?" offered Richard. "The Institute can help with independent analyses." "Actually," intervened Michael, "we're already helping. I assembled a special team to review all contracts from the last 5 years. We found interesting patterns that can strengthen Anna's case." Richard raised his eyebrows, surprised. "And when were you going to tell me about this?" "Today, actually," responded Michael with an enigmatic smile. "We have several pieces of news to share." Something in the way Michael and Anna exchanged glances alerted Richard that the news was more significant than professional matters. Before he could speculate, his cell phone vibrated with an urgent news notification. Richard's expression changed as he read the headline. "Victor Anderson was found dead in his mansion this morning." Michael and Anna leaned in to see the news. According to preliminary information, Victor had apparently suffered a heart attack during the night. At 68, he had been living practically as a recluse since his attempts to rebuild his fortune had repeatedly failed. "End of an era," commented Michael thoughtfully. After the confrontation in Boston, Victor had been forced to wear an electronic ankle monitor and was prohibited from approaching the Morgans. In the following years, he had tried several times to return to the business world, but his tarnished reputation and doors closed by the influence of Morgan developments made this impossible. "I can't feel satisfaction with this," admitted Richard, after a moment. "Just a feeling that finally we can completely turn the page." "He was a brilliant man who made terrible choices," observed Michael. "He could have built a positive legacy, but preferred the path of resentment and revenge." "Meet?" Reflection hovered over them for a few moments. It was Anna who broke the silence, gently shifting the focus of the conversation. "I think now is a good time to share our news," she said, looking at Michael for confirmation. Michael nodded, his face lighting up with a smile. "Two important things. First," he took Anna's hand, his eyes shining. "I asked Anna to marry me last week and she said yes." Richard broke into a broad smile. "That's wonderful. Congratulations to both of you." He stood up to hug the couple, truly happy with the news. Anna had become a constant presence in their lives over the last year, and Richard deeply admired her for her intelligence and integrity. "And the second news?" he asked, sitting back down. Michael and Anna exchanged another complicit look. "We've decided that after the wedding, we're going to start the adoption process," revealed Michael. "Specifically, we want to adopt older children, those who normally have less chance in the system." Richard felt a wave of emotion so intense that for a moment he couldn't speak. Michael's decision not only honored his own story, but expanded the legacy of transformation they had built together. That's extraordinary," he finally managed to say, his voice choked. "You started something important when you adopted me," explained Michael. "It wasn't just about giving a home to a child. It was about believing in someone's potential when everyone else had given up. He squeezed Anna's hand. "We want to continue that legacy, and we hope to count on Grandpa's experience," added Anna with a warm smile. Richard laughed, moved by the idea of being a grandfather. "It will be an honor, and I can guarantee I'll be the most doting grandfather in history." They toasted. With their orange juices, a tradition that now gained new meaning. As they talked about future plans, Richard couldn't help but reflect on the extraordinary journey that had brought him here. 16 years ago, he was a lonely man struggling to save his company from a devastating conspiracy. Today, he was the patriarch of a growing family and the mentor of a business ethics movement that was spreading across the country. All because he decided to trust a street boy who had warned him about a poisoned juice. "Come to think of it," commented Michael, interrupting Richard's thoughts, "I think we should invite Carl to join us. After all, he's also an important part of this story." Richard nodded, appreciating the symbolism. Carl was the living example of the philosophy that now guided both the Institute and the Morgans' personal lives. Everyone deserves a second chance, and redemption is always possible. While Michael called Carl to share the good news, Richard observed his son with immense pride. The suspicious boy from the streets had transformed into an extraordinary man, upright, compassionate, and determined to make a difference in the world. "You know what I'm thinking," said Richard, when everyone was gathered at the table. "That we should expand the Institute to include a specific program for children in vulnerable situations, not just basic assistance, but educational and professional mentoring." Michael smiled, immediately understanding his father's vision. "A program that identifies talents where no one else is looking." "Exactly. We can call it the New Perspectives Project." "I love the idea," agreed Anna. "I can help with the legal structure." "And I can offer internships here at the restaurant," added Carl. The enthusiasm was contagious. In a matter of minutes, they were all discussing possibilities and strategies for the new project, each contributing with their area of expertise. As the conversation flowed, Richard felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The tragedy that had almost destroyed his life had, paradoxically, opened the way for his greatest happiness. The universe had mysterious ways of operating, transforming threats into opportunities, enemies into allies, and casual encounters into connections that lasted a lifetime. The afternoon was advancing when they finally left the restaurant. As they went out into the sunny street, a little girl of approximately 10 approached timidly. "Excuse me," she said, holding a book. "You're Michael Morgan, aren't you? I read your story in my school library." Michael knelt to be at the girl's height. "Yes, I am. What's your name?" "Sophie. I wanted to say that your story inspired me. I'm also in the foster care system, and sometimes it seems like no one believes we can be someone important." The girl's sincerity touched everyone. Michael smiled gently. "Sophie, let me tell you a secret. We can all be important. Sometimes we just need someone who sees our potential." While Michael talked with the girl, Richard observed the scene with a full heart. The circle was completing before his eyes. The boy who had once been invisible to society now inspired the next generation to dream beyond their circumstances. As they said goodbye to Sophie, who left radiant after Michael autographed her book and invited her to visit the Institute, Richard put his arm over his son's shoulders. "It seems our story continues to inspire new chapters," he commented. Michael nodded, looking in the direction where the girl had disappeared. "That's how real changes happen, one life at a time." As they walked together under the afternoon sun, Richard knew that regardless of the challenges that would still come, the legacy they had built together of integrity, compassion, and second chances would continue to flourish through new generations. And it had all begun with a simple warning about an orange juice, demonstrating that sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge in the most unexpected moments, changing destinies forever. The end of the story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Richard and Michael has touched your hearts. To continue this exciting journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories about redemption and second chances. Find it here by clicking on the left. If you were moved by this narrative of transformation and hope, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like on the video. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of life and the power of human connections. What did you think of the ending?